My name is Martha, and I was 37 years old when I learned that sometimes justice requires taking from a man the very thing he has used as a weapon against the innocent, that retribution can be as precise and terrible as the cruelties that demand it, and that the most fitting punishment for those who abuse their power over women and children is to remove forever their ability to commit such violations. The year was 1842, and I had spent 29 years as human property on the Thornwood plantation in the cotton-growing regions of central Georgia, where the red clay soil had been enriched with the blood and tears of 3 generations of enslaved families. Master Augustus Thornwood owned 3,000 acres of prime cotton land, worked by 217 enslaved souls, but the true architect of our daily misery was not the master himself, who rarely ventured beyond the comfort of his mansion and the society of his equals. That distinction belonged to overseer Silas Brackman, a man whose cruelties had made him legendary throughout Georgia, for reasons that caused other plantation owners to speak his name with a mixture of admiration and revulsion that revealed the depths to which human nature could sink when given absolute power over the helpless. Brackman was 41 years old, a giant of a man who stood 6 feet 7 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds, with hands that could crush a man's windpipe and appetites that had transformed the Thornwood plantation from a place of mere exploitation into a theater of horrors where the systematic degradation of human dignity had been elevated to an art form that would have impressed the devil himself. But it was not Brackman's physical brutality that made him the most feared overseer in 3 counties. Though his whip had scarred the backs of every adult on the plantation, and his fists had broken bones that never healed properly in bodies that received no medical care beyond what we could provide for ourselves. The true horror of Silas Brackman lay in his particular appetite for the violation of women and children, appetites that he satisfied with the casual regularity of a man taking meals, treating the bodies of enslaved females as his personal property to be used however his desires demanded. I had been subjected to Brackman's attentions since I turned 14 years old, when my developing body had attracted his notice during one of his inspections of the female slaves who worked in the big house under his direct supervision. The first violation had occurred in the root cellar where vegetables were stored for winter use, a dark space where screams would not carry to ears that might witness what he had learned to call his supervisory privileges. "You belong to me now, girl," he had whispered as he tore away the rough dress that covered my child's body, his massive hands leaving bruises that would mark me for weeks, while his weight pressed me into the dirt floor like a grave being dug for someone who was still alive. "Every part of you, every breath you take, every thought in your head, all mine to do with as I please." The violations that followed over 23 years had destroyed whatever innocence I had possessed, while teaching me lessons about power and helplessness that no human being should ever have to learn. Brackman's appetites were not limited to simple rape. He had developed elaborate scenarios that combined physical violation with psychological torture, designed to break the spirits of women who might otherwise have found ways to resist his authority. His particular specialty was what he called education sessions for young girls who were approaching the age when their bodies would mature into forms that attracted his attention. These sessions were conducted in the privacy of his cabin, where he would explain to terrified children exactly what would be expected of them as they grew into womanhood under his authority, using methods of instruction that prepared them for years of systematic violation, while convincing them that resistance would only make their suffering worse. My own daughter, Lucy, had been subjected to one of these education sessions when she turned 12 years old, returning to our cabin with eyes that had seen too much evil for someone so young, while her small body bore evidence of violations that would have been considered crimes if committed against white children, but which were merely expressions of property rights when inflicted on enslaved girls who had no legal protection against the appetites of white men. "Mama," she had whispered that night as I held her trembling form and tried to wash away evidence of what Brackman had done to introduce her to the realities of female existence under his authority. He said, "This is how things will be until I get too old to interest him, and then it will be my daughter's turn if I ever have one." The casual way he had described the intergenerational nature of his sexual exploitation had revealed the systematic planning that went into his abuse of enslaved women, the way he viewed our bodies as renewable resources that could be consumed and replaced through the natural process of reproduction that he himself controlled, through his access to females of all ages. But Brackman's cruelties extended beyond sexual violence into territories that challenged basic assumptions about what human beings could endure while retaining any connection to their own humanity. He had developed punishment techniques that combined physical torture with sexual humiliation, creating scenarios where resistance to his advances resulted in public degradation that was designed to break the spirits of women who might encourage others to resist his authority. I had witnessed these punishments inflicted on women who had tried to protect their daughters from his educational attention, mothers who had attempted to intervene when he selected their children for his supervisory privileges, wives who had shown jealousy when their husbands were forced to watch him exercise his rights over their women. The punishments were elaborate and public, designed to teach the entire slave population about the futility of resistance, while providing entertainment for an overseer whose appetites required constant novelty to maintain his interest. The breaking point that would eventually lead to his castration came during the spring cotton planting of 1842, when my youngest daughter Rose, barely 10 years old, began showing the physical development that attracted Brackman's educational attention. Rose was small for her age, innocent in ways that her older sister Lucy had lost years earlier, possessed of a gentle spirit that had somehow survived despite growing up in conditions that destroyed such qualities in most children before they reached adolescence. "Time for this little flower to learn about the birds and the bees," Brackman announced during one of his morning inspections of the slave quarters, his pale grey eyes fixed on Rose's developing form with the calculating interest of a predator selecting his next victim. "She's got the kind of delicate features that respond well to proper instruction, the kind of natural sweetness that makes education especially rewarding." The euphemisms he used to describe child sexual abuse were part of his systematic method of normalizing activities that would have horrified civilized society, transforming criminal behavior into expressions of legitimate authority that no one had the power or standing to question. But the casual way he discussed my 10-year-old daughter's upcoming violation crystallized 23 years of accumulated rage into a focus that was as sharp and deadly as any blade ever forged. That evening, as Rose played with the cornhusk doll that represented her last connection to childhood innocence, I made the decision that would transform me from victim into executioner, from someone who endured evil into someone who would eliminate it through methods that would ensure Silas Brackman never again used his male anatomy as a weapon against helpless females. The plan that developed in my mind over the following days was both simple and comprehensive, designed to accomplish multiple objectives through a single act of surgical precision that would remove Brackman's ability to commit sexual violence while sending a message to every overseer in Georgia about the ultimate fate that awaited men who used their positions to prey upon enslaved women and children. I had learned anatomy through years of forced intimacy with Brackman's body, knowledge that had been gained through suffering, but which would serve a different purpose when applied with surgical steel, guided by maternal fury that had been building pressure like steam in a boiler for 23 years. Every scar he had left on my flesh, every violation he had committed against my daughters, every moment of degradation he had inflicted would be balanced by the removal of the organs that had made such crimes possible. The instrument I selected for his castration was a straight razor that belonged to Master Thornwood, kept sharp enough to shave the finest whiskers while possessing the strength necessary to cut through the toughest materials that might be encountered during routine grooming activities. The razor was beautiful in its simplicity, a length of steel that could be concealed easily while delivering wounds that would be both precise and permanent. But more importantly, I had identified the moment when Brackman would be most vulnerable to attack by someone who had learned to move through the plantation invisibly, someone whose presence he had grown so accustomed to that he no longer paid attention to my movements around his person. The weekly bath that he took in the wooden tub behind his cabin provided 20 minutes of complete nudity and relaxation, during which his guard was lowest and his anatomy most accessible to surgical modification. As the appointed evening approached and Rose's education session drew near, I felt a calm settle over me that I had not experienced since childhood, before Brackman's first violation had taught me to live in constant fear of his appetites. The rage that had sustained me through 23 years of systematic abuse had crystallized into something harder and more focused than mere anger, becoming a surgical instrument that would finally balance scales that had been weighted against innocent women and children for far too long. I was 37 years old, and I had learned everything there was to know about Silas Brackman's body and habits, his vulnerabilities and the precise location of organs that had served as weapons against the helpless, but which would soon be removed with the same casual efficiency that he had applied to destroying the innocence of countless girls who had been unlucky enough to attract his educational attention. The straight razor waited in its hiding place, sharp enough to perform the most delicate surgery, while strong enough to ensure that the operation would be both complete and permanent. Brackman had spent 23 years teaching me about power and helplessness, but he had never considered that such education might eventually be applied in ways that served justice rather than his own twisted appetites. Soon, the overseer who had used his male anatomy as an instrument of torture would discover what it felt like to lose forever the physical capability that had made his crimes possible, while every woman and child on the Thornwood plantation would learn that even the most brutal predator could be rendered harmless by someone who possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to eliminate the source of his power permanently. The days that followed Brackman's announcement of Rose's upcoming education session passed with agonizing slowness, each hour bringing my youngest daughter closer to violations that would destroy whatever childhood innocence had survived her 10 years of existence on a plantation where female children were viewed as future resources for an overseer's sexual gratification, rather than human beings deserving protection and care. Rose herself remained unaware of what awaited her, her natural curiosity about Brackman's educational sessions tempered by the fear that she had learned from observing her older sister Lucy's transformation from carefree child into broken young woman, whose eyes held knowledge that no 12-year-old should possess. But her innocence also made her vulnerable in ways that tore at my heart, as she continued to trust in a world that had already marked her for systematic destruction. "Mama, what do you think Mr. Brackman wants to teach me?" she asked, during one of our evening conversations in the cabin that had housed 3 generations of women who had learned to survive under conditions that challenged every assumption about human resilience and maternal protection. "Nothing that you need to know, baby girl," I replied, holding her small body against mine while trying to memorize the feel of her trust and affection before Brackman's education destroyed her ability to form such connections with anyone who might genuinely care about her welfare. The conversations I had with other enslaved women during this period revealed that my situation was not unique, that mothers throughout the plantation were watching their daughters approach the age when Brackman's educational attention would transform them from children into victims of systematic sexual exploitation that was considered normal and acceptable under the laws and customs that governed enslaved life in Georgia. Sarah, whose 14-year-old daughter had been subjected to Brackman's instruction for 2 years, provided insight into the long-term effects of such education on girls whose bodies and spirits were systematically broken through methods that ensured their complete submission to whatever demands might be placed upon them by white men who viewed them as sexual property rather than human beings. "Once he starts the education, they're never the same," Sarah told me during one of our whispered conversations in the cotton fields, where supervision was relaxed enough to allow brief exchanges of information and support. "The light goes out of their eyes, and they start moving through life like they're already dead inside, just waiting for someone to bury the body." Her words confirmed what I had observed in Lucy and other girls who had completed Brackman's educational program. The way systematic sexual abuse transformed vibrant children into hollow versions of their former selves, beings who functioned according to the requirements placed upon them, but who had lost whatever spark of humanity might have sustained them through conditions that would otherwise have been unbearable. But Sarah's description also revealed the scope of damage that extended far beyond individual victims to encompass entire families and communities that were forced to witness the systematic destruction of their children while being powerless to intervene through conventional means. The psychological trauma affected not just the girls who were directly victimized, but their mothers, fathers, siblings, and friends who had to watch innocent children being transformed into broken adults through methods that violated every instinct for protecting the young. The planning for Brackman's castration intensified during this period as I refined my understanding of his routines while practicing the precise movements that would be required to perform surgical removal of organs that had been used as weapons against helpless females for 23 years. The straight razor became an extension of my hand during evening hours when I could practice the motions without attracting attention, learning to make cuts that would be both clean and complete. But the most challenging aspect of my preparation was maintaining the facade of submissive acceptance that had kept me alive for 29 years, while my mind focused entirely on planning an act of violence that would transform me from victim into executioner. Brackman's confidence in my complete subjugation had to be preserved until the moment when surgical steel revealed the reality of rage that had been building pressure like steam in a sealed container. The breakthrough in my planning came through careful observation of Brackman's bathing routine, which revealed vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who had learned to move through the plantation invisibly while maintaining the appearance of routine domestic activity. His weekly bath was conducted in complete privacy behind his cabin during evening hours when other slaves were confined to quarters, and his attention was focused entirely on personal hygiene rather than security concerns. The positioning required for effective castration would place me within arm's reach of a man whose physical strength exceeded my own by margins that would make resistance futile if he retained consciousness and mobility after the initial surgical incision. Success would require swift and precise action that severed not just his male organs, but also major blood vessels that would ensure rapid loss of consciousness through blood loss that would prevent defensive reactions. My anatomical knowledge, gained through 23 years of forced intimacy with Brackman's body, included detailed understanding of the blood supply that maintained his male anatomy, and the specific locations where surgical cuts would cause maximum damage, while ensuring that the operation could not be reversed through any medical intervention that might be available on the plantation. The castration would be complete and permanent, transforming him from sexual predator into eunuch whose criminal capabilities would be eliminated forever. As Rose's education session approached and the final details of my plan fell into place, I began experiencing a psychological transformation that went beyond simple preparation for violence into territories that challenged my understanding of my own identity and moral framework. The woman who had endured 29 years of systematic abuse was evolving into someone capable of surgical precision in the application of justice that conventional authority would never provide. The other enslaved women began to sense that something fundamental had changed in my demeanor, though none understood the specific nature of the transformation that was preparing me for actions that would alter the power dynamics of the entire plantation. My movements had acquired a purposefulness that went beyond routine domestic activities, while my eyes held a focus that suggested planning that extended far beyond daily survival. "You got that look about you," observed old Clara, a woman who had survived 40 years of plantation life through a combination of wisdom and careful invisibility. "That look that says you done made peace with something that other folks wouldn't understand. You be careful about whatever you're contemplating, child." Her warning carried the authority of accumulated experience, with the consequences that followed when enslaved people decided to take direct action against their oppressors. But it also carried recognition that some circumstances made such action inevitable regardless of the personal costs that might result. The systematic sexual abuse of children represented a line that could not be crossed without provoking responses that transcended normal calculations of risk versus benefit. But the most significant development during this period was the emergence of what could only be called community support for whatever action I was planning, though none of the women who provided this support understood the specific nature of what I intended to accomplish through Brackman's surgical modification. The mothers who had watched their daughters destroyed by his educational programs understood that conventional resistance had proven futile and that unconventional methods might be necessary for protecting future generations. "Whatever you're planning, you got folks who'll support you however they can," Martha told me during one of our conversations in the laundry, where domestic work provided cover for discussions that could not be conducted in more public settings. Too many babies been hurt by that monster. Too many mothers had to watch their children get destroyed. Time somebody did something that would make it stop permanently. The community consensus that had developed around the necessity for decisive action against Brackman revealed the extent to which his sexual predation had affected not just individual victims, but the entire social fabric of enslaved life on the plantation. His systematic abuse of women and children had created trauma that extended far beyond his direct victims, affecting families and communities that were forced to witness crimes against their most vulnerable members, while being powerless to provide protection through conventional means. As the evening of Rose's scheduled education session arrived, and Brackman prepared for the weekly bath that would provide the opportunity for his surgical modification, I felt a sense of destiny settling over me like a mantle that had been waiting my entire life for someone worthy to wear it. The straight razor felt warm against my skin, where it rested concealed beneath my dress, while my heart beat with the steady rhythm of someone who had finally discovered their true purpose. The transformation from victim to executioner was complete, guided by maternal love that had been refined into surgical precision through 29 years of accumulated suffering and 23 years of specific preparation for this moment when justice would finally be delivered through methods that ensured the crimes could never be repeated. Silas Brackman had taught me everything I needed to know about his anatomy and vulnerabilities, though he had never intended such education to serve the purposes for which it would ultimately be employed. The sun was setting over the Georgia cotton fields, painting the sky in colors that seemed prophetic of the blood that would soon flow in payment for crimes that had gone unpunished for too long. Behind his cabin, Brackman was preparing for the bath that would mark the end of his career as a sexual predator, though he had no way of knowing that the woman who had served his appetites for 23 years was approaching with surgical steel and the determination to ensure that his male anatomy would never again be used as a weapon against innocent children. The evening of March 18, 1842, arrived wrapped in the kind of stillness that precedes violent storms, with the air itself seeming to hold its breath, while destiny prepared to balance scales that had been weighted against innocent women and children for far too long. I moved through my final preparations with the methodical precision of someone who understood that success would require flawless execution, while failure would result in death, preceded by tortures that would make 23 years of sexual abuse seem gentle by comparison. Brackman had spent the day conducting his usual rounds of intimidation and violation, using his massive frame and reputation for creative cruelty to maintain the atmosphere of terror that kept 217 enslaved souls in complete submission to his authority. But his evening routine remained as predictable as sunrise, governed by habits that had been established through years of confidence in his own invulnerability, and the systematic elimination of anyone who might pose a threat to his safety. The wooden tub that served for his weekly bath sat behind his cabin in a location that provided privacy while remaining close enough to the main plantation buildings that screams of distress could summon assistance if circumstances required intervention. But the isolation also created opportunities for someone who had learned to move invisibly through the plantation while maintaining the appearance of routine domestic activity. Someone whose presence had become so familiar that it attracted no attention from a man whose guard had been lowered by 23 years of unchallenged dominance. I watched from concealment as Brackman began his bathing preparations, his massive body moving with the casual confidence of someone who had never imagined that his victims might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to transform suffering into surgical precision. The sight of his nakedness, which had once filled me with terror and revulsion, now provided only clinical interest in the anatomy that would soon be permanently modified through methods that he had never anticipated. The straight razor rested against my ribs where it had been secured with strips of cloth, its keen edge promising justice that had been delayed for decades while children suffered violations that destroyed their spirits along with their bodies. The weight of the instrument felt significant, not just as a physical tool, but as a symbol of maternal love that had been refined into something harder and more focused than mere revenge, becoming surgical precision that would eliminate forever the source of Brackman's power over helpless females. His routine was exactly as I had observed during weeks of careful surveillance. First, the removal of clothing that revealed scars from fights and accidents that had marked his body during 41 years of violence against others, then the slow immersion in water that had been heated to temperatures that would relax muscles and dull reflexes while creating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by someone who understood the relationship between comfort and carelessness. "Another day of keeping the animals in line," he muttered to himself as he settled into the tub, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who took genuine pleasure in the systematic degradation of human dignity. Tomorrow, young Rose learns what it means to grow up female and black on a plantation where white men know how to make use of what God provided. His casual reference to my daughter's upcoming violation crystallized 29 years of accumulated rage into surgical focus that would guide the razor toward targets that had been selected with anatomical precision, born of forced familiarity with organs that had served as instruments of torture, but which would soon be permanently removed from service. The education he planned for Rose would never occur, because the educator would lack the physical equipment necessary for conducting such lessons. I emerged from concealment with movements that were silent and purposeful, crossing the distance between hiding place and target with steps that had been practiced until they became automatic, instinctive, inevitable. The razor appeared in my hand like an extension of my will, while Brackman's attention remained focused on relaxation and anticipation of pleasures that would never be experienced, because justice had finally arrived, wearing the face of a woman whose suffering had taught her everything necessary about the precise application of retributive surgery. "Silas," I said softly, my voice carrying just enough unusual tone to make him turn toward the sound, without immediately recognizing the danger that was approaching with surgical steel held in hands that had learned precision through years of forced service to his appetites. He turned in the tub with the slow movements of someone whose reflexes had been dulled by hot water and overconfidence, his pale gray eyes widening with surprise as they focused on the razor that gleamed in the evening light like a silver flame bringing purification to anatomy that had been corrupted by decades of systematic abuse of power. Recognition of his danger came too late to serve as protection against steel that had been guided by perfect knowledge of his vulnerabilities. "What the hell do you think you're—" he began, but the question was never completed. The first cut severed the blood vessels that supplied his male organs, creating wounds that would ensure rapid loss of consciousness while preventing any medical intervention that might preserve the anatomy that had made his crimes possible. The precision was surgical, learned through 23 years of forced intimacy that had provided anatomical knowledge more detailed than any medical textbook could offer. Brackman's eyes went wide with shock and disbelief as he processed what was happening to the organs that had defined his power over enslaved women, his massive hands clutching at wounds that were bleeding with intensity that spoke of severed arteries rather than superficial cuts. The hot water that had been intended for relaxation became crimson with blood that carried away his ability to commit the violations that had marked his career as an overseer. "This is for Rose," I whispered, as the razor completed its work, removing with clinical precision the male anatomy that had been used as weapons against helpless children. "And for Lucy, and for every girl whose innocence you destroyed with your education sessions." The castration was complete and irreversible, performed with surgical skill that ensured no possibility of regeneration or repair. The organs that had served as instruments of torture for 23 years lay severed in the bloodied water, while Brackman's consciousness began fading through blood loss that would soon render him unable to comprehend the justice that had finally caught up with his crimes against humanity. His mouth opened as if to scream, but only blood emerged while his massive frame began the process of shock that would precede either death or survival as a permanently modified version of his former self. Either outcome would serve the purpose of ensuring that he could never again use male anatomy to violate women and children who had no power to resist his educational attention. "You always said I belonged to you," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I had accomplished through precise application of surgical steel. "But some things belong to God, and God don't approve of men who use their bodies to hurt children. Tonight you learn what it feels like to lose the part of yourself that you used as a weapon against the innocent." The symbolism was perfect in its completeness. The overseer who had defined his power through sexual domination of enslaved females would survive, if he survived at all, as someone whose physical capacity for such domination had been permanently eliminated through methods that he had never imagined might be turned against him. The education he had provided about anatomy and vulnerability had finally been applied for purposes that served justice rather than his own twisted appetites. I cleaned the razor in the water that had become crimson with Brackman's blood, then secured it again beneath my dress, where it would remain hidden during whatever investigation might follow his discovery. The evidence of surgical precision would raise questions about who might possess the anatomical knowledge necessary for such complete castration, but the list of suspects would include every woman on the plantation who had been subjected to his educational attention over the decades of his employment. The walk back to my cabin was conducted with the same invisible efficiency that had carried me to Brackman's bath, my movements betraying no sign of the surgery I had just performed, while my mind processed the psychological transformation that accompanied the shift from victim to executioner. The woman who had endured 29 years of systematic abuse had been replaced by someone capable of surgical precision in the application of justice that conventional authority would never provide. Rose was sleeping peacefully when I returned, her small body curled beneath the rough blanket that provided inadequate protection against Georgia winters, but which would shield her from educational sessions that would never occur because the educator had been permanently modified through methods that he had never anticipated. Her innocence was safe, protected by maternal love that had finally found expression through surgical steel rather than passive endurance. The other women in the slave quarters sensed that something fundamental had changed in the power dynamics of the plantation, though none yet understood the specific nature of what had been accomplished behind Brackman's cabin. The psychological atmosphere seemed lighter somehow, as if a source of poison that had infected every aspect of daily existence had been suddenly neutralized through methods that remained mysterious, but whose effects were already apparent. Old Clara approached me as I settled onto my pallet, her weathered face showing recognition that the transformation she had observed in my demeanor had reached its completion through actions that would alter the trajectory of life for every woman and child on the Thornwood plantation. "You've done what needed doing," she said simply, her voice carrying the authority of accumulated wisdom that came from surviving 40 years under conditions that had tested every assumption about human resilience and maternal protection. Whatever it was, however you accomplished it, you'd done what needed doing for all of us who got daughters and granddaughters that deserve better than what that monster been providing. Her words confirmed that community support for my actions extended beyond mere approval into territories that approached reverence for someone who had finally found a way to eliminate a source of systematic suffering that had affected every family on the plantation. The surgical modification of Silas Brackman would serve as both justice for past crimes and protection for future generations of children who would grow up free from his educational attention. As I lay on my straw mattress listening to the sounds of a plantation settling into nighttime quiet, I felt a peace that I had not experienced since childhood, before Brackman's first violation had taught me to live in constant fear of his appetites. The rage that had sustained me through decades of abuse had been transformed into something more useful than mere anger, becoming surgical precision that had finally balanced scales weighted too long against innocent women and children. The straight razor had served its purpose with efficiency that would have impressed the finest surgeons, guided by anatomical knowledge that had been acquired through suffering, but which ultimately served justice rather than the twisted education that Brackman had intended. His male anatomy, severed from his body with surgical precision, would never again serve as weapons against helpless females who deserved protection rather than violation. Tomorrow would bring discovery and investigation, questions and consequences that might threaten everyone who could have possessed the knowledge and motivation necessary for such complete castration. But tonight belonged to the satisfaction of knowing that Rose would wake up in a world where her innocence was protected by more than just hope and prayer, where maternal love had finally found expression through methods that transcended passive endurance to achieve active protection of the vulnerable. I was 37 years old, and I had learned that sometimes justice requires taking from evil men the very instruments they use to commit their crimes, that surgical precision can be more effective than conventional resistance, that the most fitting punishment for sexual predators is the permanent removal of their capacity to commit such violations. Silas Brackman had taught me everything I needed to know about his anatomy and vulnerabilities, though he had never intended such education to serve the purposes for which it had ultimately been employed. The fields of anguish that had surrounded the Thornwood plantation were beginning their transformation into something approaching hope, watered with the blood of a man whose crimes had finally earned the most appropriate punishment imaginable. the surgical removal of organs that had served as weapons against children, ensuring that such weapons could never be employed again in the service of systematic evil that masqueraded as legitimate authority. The discovery of Brackman's condition came at dawn, when his failure to appear for morning inspection triggered a search that led to the horrifying scene behind his cabin, where the overseer, who had terrorized the plantation for 16 years, lay unconscious in a tub of bloodied water, his male anatomy severed with surgical precision that spoke of anatomical knowledge far beyond what most people possessed. The screams of the house slave who found him echoed across the plantation like the cries of someone who had witnessed the wrath of God, made manifest in human flesh and surgical steel. Master Thornwood's reaction to the news was immediate and volcanic, his face turning purple with rage as he processed the implications of what had been done to his most effective instrument of slave control. The castration represented not just violence against his employee, but challenge to the fundamental assumptions about power and vulnerability that made plantation society possible, demonstration that even the most brutal overseer could be rendered harmless by someone who possessed the knowledge and determination necessary to eliminate the source of his authority permanently. "Summon Doctor Harrison immediately," Master Thornwood commanded, while examining the scene of surgical precision that had transformed his overseer from sexual predator into eunuch whose capacity for the violations that had defined his career had been permanently eliminated. "And send riders to alert the sheriff and every plantation owner within 50 miles. This kind of organized resistance cannot be allowed to spread beyond our boundaries." The medical examination that followed confirmed what was already obvious to anyone who observed Brackman's condition. The castration had been performed with surgical skill that suggested intimate knowledge of male anatomy, precise cuts that had severed not only organs, but also major blood vessels in ways that prevented any possibility of surgical repair or regeneration. The overseer would survive, but he would live as a permanently modified version of his former self, unable to commit the violations that had made him legendary throughout Georgia for reasons that no civilized person should have to understand. Dr. Harrison's conclusions were delivered with professional detachment that failed to conceal his own horror at the precision that had been employed in Brackman's modification. His medical expertise allowed him to appreciate the surgical skill that had guided the razor, while his understanding of plantation dynamics helped him recognize the symbolic significance of castration as punishment for crimes that conventional justice would never address adequately. "The cuts were made by someone with extensive knowledge of male anatomy," he reported to Master Thornwood during a consultation that I overheard, while maintaining the facade of domestic service that had kept me alive for 29 years. "Whoever performed this surgery knew exactly where to cut for maximum effect while ensuring survival, suggesting either medical training or intimate familiarity with the victim's body acquired through other means." The implication was clear to anyone who understood the realities of plantation life. Brackman's castration had most likely been performed by one of his sexual victims, someone whose forced intimacy with his anatomy had provided the knowledge necessary for its surgical removal. But the list of potential suspects included every woman on the plantation who had been subjected to his educational attention over the decades of his employment, making identification of the specific perpetrator virtually impossible through conventional investigation. The interrogations that followed were conducted with systematic brutality, designed to extract confessions through methods that would have impressed the Inquisition, but they yielded no information that could identify who had possessed the anatomical knowledge and surgical skill necessary for Brackman's complete castration. The enslaved women who were questioned maintained their silence with solidarity that demonstrated the community support my actions had generated, while their refusal to provide information created additional frustration for investigators who were accustomed to breaking slave resistance through escalating violence. Sheriff Morrison's involvement brought legal authority that transformed the investigation from internal plantation discipline into official criminal proceedings, but his methods proved no more effective than Master Thornwood's interrogations at identifying the perpetrator of what he called the most precisely executed act of slave rebellion in Georgia history. The surgical precision that had guided the castration had left no evidence that could be traced to specific individuals, while the community silence that protected the guilty also shielded the innocent from consequences that might have been imposed through guilt by association. Someone on this plantation possesses medical knowledge that goes far beyond what we would expect from agricultural laborers, Sheriff Morrison concluded after a week of fruitless investigation. But that knowledge appears to be protected by conspiracy that includes every woman who might have been subjected to Brackman's supervisory methods over the years. The failure of official investigation to identify Brackman's surgical modifier created a climate of uncertainty and fear among plantation owners throughout central Georgia. Men who began to understand that their own overseers might be vulnerable to similar treatment if their methods of slave management included activities that could motivate surgical retaliation. The precise nature of Brackman's punishment sent a message that was both specific and general. Sexual predators who used their positions to abuse enslaved women and children faced the possibility of permanent modification that would eliminate their capacity for such crimes. But the most significant consequence of Brackman's castration was not legal or administrative, but psychological. The demonstration that even the most brutal overseer could be rendered harmless through surgical precision had fundamentally altered the power dynamics of plantation life, creating possibilities for resistance that had not existed while he retained his full physical capacity for intimidation and sexual violence. The enslaved women who had lived in terror of his educational attention for decades began moving with confidence that reflected their understanding that the source of their deepest fears had been permanently neutralized. Children played with laughter that had been absent from the plantation during the years when Brackman's presence had cast shadows over every aspect of daily existence, while mothers looked at their daughters with hope rather than dread as they contemplated their children's futures. Rose herself remained unaware of how close she had come to educational sessions that would have destroyed her innocence, but her continued ability to trust and smile provided daily confirmation that maternal love had successfully protected what needed protecting through methods that conventional resistance could never have achieved. Her 10-year-old body would develop into womanhood without the scars that had marked her sister Lucy, while her spirit would remain intact because the predator who had planned her violation had been permanently disabled through surgical precision, guided by accumulated rage transformed into protective action. Lucy, now 13 years old and bearing psychological wounds that would never fully heal, showed the first signs of recovery that I had observed since her own educational sessions had begun a year earlier. The knowledge that Brackman could never again hurt her or any other child seemed to lift weights from her shoulders that had been pressing down on her spirit with crushing force, while her eyes began to show sparks of the person she might have become if she had been allowed to grow up without systematic violation. "Mama," she said during one of our evening conversations, "something's different about Mr. Brackman. He don't look at us the same way anymore. Don't talk about education like he used to. What happened to him?" "Sometimes God answers prayers in ways we don't expect," I replied, holding her close, while marveling at the resilience that allowed children to begin healing, even from wounds that had seemed permanent and irreversible. "Sometimes justice comes from directions that evil men never anticipate, delivered by hands that they never considered dangerous." The recovery was gradual and partial, but it was real in ways that gave meaning to everything I had risked through surgical modification of a man whose crimes had gone unpunished for far too long. The elimination of Brackman's capacity for sexual violence had created space for healing that could never have existed, while he retained the physical equipment necessary for continued violations. But the most profound change was not in individual victims, but in the collective psychology of the plantation community. The knowledge that someone among them had possessed the courage and skill to permanently disable their primary oppressor had created a sense of empowerment that transcended the specific circumstances of Brackman's castration, suggesting possibilities for resistance that extended far beyond surgical retaliation against sexual predators. The network of communication that had protected my identity during the investigation had evolved into something approaching organized solidarity, with enslaved women throughout the plantation understanding that their collective silence had power that could not be broken through conventional intimidation. The community that had been fragmented by Brackman's policy of using victims against each other had been reunited through shared commitment to protecting whoever had eliminated the source of their systematic suffering. Old Clara's observations during this period revealed the broader implications of what had been accomplished through precise application of surgical steel to problems that conventional authority would never address adequately. "You changed more than just one man's anatomy," she told me during one of our conversations in the laundry, where domestic work provided cover for discussions that could not be conducted in more public settings. "You changed the way all of us think about what's possible when circumstances get pushed beyond the point, where endurance becomes collaboration with evil." Her words captured something essential about the transformation that had occurred not just in Brackman's physical condition, but in the fundamental understanding of agency and resistance that had been awakened among people who had spent their entire lives being told that submission was their only option for survival. The surgical precision that had eliminated his capacity for sexual violence had demonstrated that even the most carefully controlled victims possessed forms of power that their oppressors never suspected. As autumn approached and the cotton harvest demanded intensive labor coordination, the plantation operated under management that bore little resemblance to the reign of terror that had defined Brackman's previous 16 years of authority. His physical modifications had eliminated not just his capacity for sexual violence, but also the psychological intimidation that had depended on the implicit threat of such violence as punishment for resistance or disobedience. The replacement overseer, brought in from a neighboring plantation, possessed neither the physical capacity nor the psychological inclination for the systematic sexual abuse that had marked his predecessor's career. His management style was brutal when he felt brutality was necessary, but it lacked the sadistic creativity that had made Brackman legendary throughout Georgia for reasons that civilized people preferred not to discuss in detail. "Things feel different now," Sarah observed during one of our conversations in the cotton fields, where supervision was relaxed enough to allow brief exchanges of information and mutual support. "Still hard work, still plenty of punishment for those who don't meet quotas, but not the same kind of fear that used to hang over everything we did, especially not the fear that our daughters couldn't be protected from educational attention that would destroy their spirits along with their bodies." The change she described was fundamental and lasting, representing a shift in power dynamics that went far beyond the simple replacement of one overseer with another. The surgical elimination of Brackman's capacity for sexual predation had removed a source of psychological terror that had affected every aspect of plantation life, creating space for forms of human dignity that had been impossible while he retained his full physical capacity for intimidation and violation. But perhaps the most significant consequence of my actions was the message that had spread throughout the slave communities of central Georgia and beyond, carried by networks of communication that connected plantations across hundreds of miles while remaining invisible to white observation. The story of Brackman's surgical modification had become legend, inspiring other women who found themselves in similar circumstances while warning overseers and masters that sexual predation might carry consequences that conventional authority could not protect them from experiencing. Heard tell of another overseer over in Burke County who got himself surgically modified, reported a field hand whose cousin worked on a plantation near Augusta. Man named Collins, who was famous for his educational methods, found himself missing the equipment necessary for conducting such instruction. Strange how these accidents seem to be happening to men with particular reputations for teaching young girls about adult responsibilities. The pattern suggested that the surgical techniques I had employed were being adapted and applied by other women who had learned that some forms of justice could only be delivered through methods that conventional resistance could never achieve. The knowledge that sexual predators could be permanently disabled through precise application of surgical steel was spreading through slave communities like seeds carried on wind that connected plantations throughout the region. As the first anniversary of Brackman's castration approached, I reflected on the changes that had been accomplished through one night's work with a straight razor guided by anatomical knowledge, gained through 23 years of forced intimacy with organs that had served as weapons against innocent children. The surgical precision that had eliminated his capacity for sexual violence had protected not just my own daughters, but had sent ripples throughout the community that continued to provide protection for vulnerable females who might otherwise have faced similar educational attention. The straight razor had been returned to its original location in Master Thornwood's shaving kit, where it continued to serve its intended purpose while carrying no evidence of the surgery that had been performed with its edge. But the knowledge that had guided its application remained available for future use if circumstances ever again required surgical intervention to protect children from predators who used their positions of authority to satisfy twisted appetites. Rose was now 11 years old, developing into young womanhood without the scars that had marked her sister's childhood. Her innocence protected by maternal love that had found expression through methods that transcended passive endurance to achieve active elimination of threats to vulnerable children. Her laughter provided daily confirmation that some victories were worth any price that might be demanded by earthly justice, while her trust demonstrated that protective action could indeed preserve what needed preserving. Lucy showed continued signs of healing from wounds that had once seemed permanent. Her recovery, providing evidence that even the most damaged spirits could begin to repair themselves when the source of their destruction was permanently eliminated. The 13-year-old who had once moved through life like she was already dead inside was beginning to show sparks of the person she might still become, given time and the absence of continued violation. I was 38 years old, and I had learned that justice sometimes requires surgical precision in its application, that the most fitting punishment for sexual predators is the permanent removal of their capacity to commit such crimes, that maternal love can find expression through methods that conventional morality might never approve, but which serve purposes that transcend social approval. Silas Brackman had been permanently modified through techniques that he had never imagined might be turned against him, ensuring that his educational methods could never again destroy the innocence of children who deserved protection rather than violation. The blood of justice had flowed behind his cabin on a Georgia evening when surgical steel had finally balanced scales that had been weighted against innocent women and children for far too long. The fields of anguish that surrounded the Thornwood plantation were being transformed into something approaching hope, watered not with tears of victims, but with the blood of a predator whose anatomy had been permanently altered to match the damage he had inflicted on vulnerable souls who had no power to resist his educational attention. The razor's edge had served justice with precision that left no room for doubt about its effectiveness, while the community solidarity that had protected my identity demonstrated forms of resistance that went far beyond individual action to encompass collective commitment to protecting whoever had eliminated a source of systematic suffering. The surgical modification of one man's anatomy had sent messages throughout Georgia that sexual predators who used their positions to abuse enslaved women and children faced possibilities that conventional authority could never protect them from experiencing. The second autumn following Brackman's surgical modification brought with it evidence that the precision of his castration had created ripple effects extending far beyond the boundaries of the Thornwood plantation, as reports filtered through slave networks about similar incidents affecting overseers and masters throughout the cotton-growing regions of Georgia and beyond. The surgical techniques that had eliminated his capacity for sexual predation were being adapted and refined by women who had learned that some forms of justice could only be achieved through methods that left no evidence for conventional investigation. The transformation of plantation life under Brackman's continued but modified supervision had demonstrated that sexual predation was not an inevitable component of slave management, but rather a personal choice made by men who used their positions of authority to satisfy twisted appetites that had nothing to do with agricultural productivity or labor discipline. His replacement as sexual predator by no one at all had improved rather than damaged the efficiency of plantation operations, while creating an atmosphere where women and children could focus on survival rather than constantly calculating escape routes from educational attention. Rose, now 12 years old and safely navigating the developmental changes that had once made her a target for Brackman's instructional interest, represented living proof that maternal protection could indeed preserve innocence through methods that transcended conventional resistance. Her ability to trust and smile provided daily confirmation that surgical intervention had achieved its intended purpose of eliminating threats to vulnerable children while creating space for natural development uncontaminated by premature exposure to adult cruelties. "I heard other girls talking about education sessions," she mentioned during one of our evening conversations, her voice carrying curiosity rather than fear as she processed information about experiences that she would never have to endure. But Mr. Brackman don't conduct those anymore, do he? He just seems different now, like something important changed about him. Some men learn that their actions have consequences they never anticipated, I replied, marveling at her innocence that had been preserved through surgical precision, guided by maternal love that would accept any price for protecting what needed protection. Mr. Brackman learned that lesson in ways that ensure he won't forget it. Lucy's continued recovery from wounds that had once seemed permanent provided additional evidence that elimination of ongoing trauma could create space for healing, even from damage that had appeared irreversible. At 14, she was beginning to show glimpses of the person she might have become if she had been allowed to grow up without systematic violation, her spirit slowly emerging from protective shells that had been necessary for psychological survival during the worst periods of Brackman's educational attention. The network of communication that had developed among enslaved women throughout the region revealed the scope of changes that were occurring as the surgical techniques employed in Brackman's modification spread to address similar problems on plantations where overseers had built their authority on sexual predation rather than agricultural expertise. The knowledge that such predators could be permanently disabled through precise application of surgical steel was transforming the landscape of plantation management in ways that conventional resistance had never achieved. "Heard from my sister over in Richmond County," reported Sarah during one of our conversations in the fields where cotton picking provided cover for exchanges of information that connected slave communities across hundreds of miles. Their overseer, a man named Henderson, who was famous for his educational methods, got himself surgically modified last month, woke up one morning to discover that his teaching equipment had been permanently removed during the night. The pattern was becoming recognizable to those who understood what to look for. Sexual predators, who had used their positions to abuse enslaved women and children, were experiencing accidents that involved surgical removal of organs that had served as weapons against the helpless. The precision required for such operations suggested coordinated sharing of anatomical knowledge and surgical techniques that had been developed through forced intimacy with predators' bodies. But perhaps most significantly, the psychological impact of these surgical interventions was creating changes in overseer behavior that extended far beyond the individuals who had been directly modified. Men whose management methods had included sexual intimidation were reconsidering their approaches as word spread about colleagues who had been permanently disabled through techniques that left no evidence for investigation while ensuring that the punishment fit the crime with surgical precision. Dr. Harrison's medical practice had begun, including consultations with plantation owners who were concerned about what they called the epidemic of genital injuries affecting supervisory personnel throughout central Georgia. His professional observations revealed the scope of changes occurring as surgical retaliation spread through networks that remained invisible to conventional authority while demonstrating remarkable consistency in technique and effectiveness. I've now treated 11 cases of what appears to be deliberate castration performed with surgical precision, he reported during a meeting of plantation owners that I overheard while serving refreshments. All victims were men known for unconventional approaches to slave discipline involving female property. The surgical skill required suggests either medical training or intimate knowledge of male anatomy acquired through other means. His clinical description failed to capture the justice that had been served through surgical steel, but it confirmed that the techniques I had employed were spreading throughout the region as other women discovered that sexual predators could be eliminated permanently through methods that conventional resistance could never achieve. The anatomical knowledge required for such precision was being shared through networks that connected victims while remaining invisible to the perpetrators who had never imagined that their educational attention might provide information that could be used against them. The economic impact of surgical retaliation was beginning to affect plantation operations as qualified overseers became reluctant to accept positions that seemed to carry unusual risks of genital modification. The supply of men willing to employ sexual intimidation as a management technique contracted dramatically as word spread about colleagues who had been permanently disabled through methods that no amount of physical strength or legal authority could prevent. "Can't find decent supervisors anymore," complained Colonel Morrison during a conversation with Master Thornwood. Men are demanding guarantees that their positions won't involve the kind of disciplinary responsibilities that seem to be attracting surgical attention from persons unknown. Some are even requesting hazard pay for accepting jobs on plantations where previous overseers have experienced anatomical difficulties. The transformation of labor market dynamics represented exactly what I had hoped might result from demonstrating that sexual predators were vulnerable to retaliation that could eliminate their capacity for crimes that conventional justice would never address adequately. The surgical modification of individual offenders was creating systemic changes that protected countless women and children who might otherwise have faced similar educational attention. Master Thornwood himself had been forced to modify his approach to plantation management, as reports of surgical retaliation created concerns about the safety of supervisory personnel who employed methods that might attract the attention of whoever was performing castrations with such remarkable precision and consistency. His hiring practices now emphasized agricultural experience rather than innovative disciplinary techniques, while his instructions to new overseers specifically cautioned against activities that might motivate surgical intervention. Focus on productivity rather than creative punishment methods, he advised the latest replacement for Brackman's original position. Recent events suggest that certain approaches to slave management carry risks that conventional authority cannot protect against. The goal is profitable agriculture, not entertainment through unconventional educational techniques. The institutionalization of lessons learned through surgical retaliation represented victory that extended far beyond individual acts of justice to encompass systemic changes in how plantation society approached the management of enslaved populations. The elimination of sexual predation as a routine component of overseer authority had been accomplished through methods that left no evidence for investigation, while ensuring that the changes would be permanent and irreversible. As the third anniversary of Brackman's castration approached, I reflected on the chain of consequences that had flowed from one night's work with a straight razor guided by anatomical knowledge gained through 23 years of forced intimacy with organs that had served as weapons against innocent children. The surgical precision that had eliminated his capacity for sexual violence had seeded changes throughout the region that continued to protect vulnerable females who might otherwise have faced similar violations. The knowledge that had made such precision possible was now being passed between trusted women through networks that connected plantations across multiple states, carried by the same invisible communication systems that had always linked enslaved communities while remaining undetectable to white observation. The techniques were being refined and adapted to address local circumstances, while maintaining the surgical accuracy that made them effective against predators who had never imagined that their victims might possess the intelligence and determination necessary to eliminate threats permanently. But the most profound change was not in individual cases of surgical retaliation, but in the fundamental understanding of agency and resistance that had been awakened among people who had spent their entire lives being told that submission was their only option for survival. The demonstration that even the most brutal sexual predators could be rendered harmless through careful planning and precise action had revealed forms of power that their oppressors had never suspected existed. Rose and Lucy, now 13 and 15 years old respectively, were growing into young women whose development had been shaped by the knowledge that maternal love could indeed protect what needed protecting through methods that transcended passive endurance to achieve active elimination of threats to innocent children. Their ability to navigate adolescence without the psychological scars that had marked previous generations testified to the effectiveness of surgical intervention in creating space for natural development uncontaminated by premature exposure to adult cruelties. The straight razor that had served justice with such precision remained available for future use if circumstances ever again required surgical intervention to protect children from predators who use positions of authority to satisfy twisted appetites. But the knowledge that had guided its application had spread throughout the region, carried by women who understood that some forms of resistance could only be achieved through methods that left no evidence for conventional investigation while ensuring that punishment fit crimes with surgical accuracy. I was 40 years old, and I had learned that justice sometimes requires surgical precision in its application, that maternal love can find expression through methods that society would never approve, but which serve purposes that transcend social conventions. That the elimination of individual predators can create systemic changes that protect countless children who might otherwise face similar violations. The blood that had flowed behind Brackman's cabin had watered seeds of resistance that were now blooming throughout the cotton-growing regions where enslaved women had discovered their own forms of power. The harvest of retribution continued throughout the South as surgical techniques spread through networks that remained invisible to conventional authority, while demonstrating remarkable effectiveness in eliminating sexual predators who had used their positions to abuse enslaved women and children. The castration that had eliminated one man's capacity for violation had become a symbol of possibilities that extended far beyond individual acts of justice to encompass fundamental changes in the relationship between oppressor and oppressed. The fields that had once known only anguish were being transformed into something approaching hope, not through legal reform or moral persuasion, but through surgical steel guided by anatomical knowledge that had been gained through suffering, but which ultimately served protection rather than exploitation. The most fitting punishment for sexual predators had proven to be the permanent removal of their capacity to commit such crimes, delivered through methods that ensured that justice would be both complete and irreversible. This was the story of Martha of Georgia, the enslaved woman who castrated overseer Silas Brackman in March of 1842, using surgical precision learned through 23 years of forced intimacy to permanently eliminate his capacity for the sexual violence that had terrorized the Thornwood plantation for 16 years. Her act of precisely targeted retaliation inspired what became known as the Razor Network, a system of knowledge sharing among enslaved women throughout the South that used surgical techniques to eliminate sexual predators while maintaining complete secrecy through solidarity that protected participants from investigation. The systematic castration of cruel overseers that followed created labor shortages and economic pressures that forced plantation owners to abandon sexual intimidation as a management technique, not from moral conviction, but from practical necessity when qualified supervisors became impossible to recruit or retain. Martha's demonstration that even the most brutal sexual predators could be permanently disabled through careful planning and anatomical knowledge transformed the psychological relationship between enslaved people and their oppressors throughout the cotton-growing regions, revealing vulnerabilities in systems of control that had seemed absolute to previous generations. She lived to see the end of slavery in 1865, spending her later years teaching midwifery to freed women while privately sharing knowledge about anatomy and surgical techniques that had once served far deadlier purposes than childbirth assistance. Her daughters Rose and Lucy grew up protected from the sexual violence that had shaped their mother's existence, living proof that surgical intervention could indeed preserve innocence through methods that transcended conventional forms of resistance and maternal protection. The echoes of Martha's surgical justice cut deep through time, a reminder that precision can triumph over brute force. If these untold stories of calculated retribution stir your soul, join our community. Subscribe to our channel to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of American slavery. Your support helps us keep these powerful narratives alive, ensuring that the voices of those who wielded the surgeon's blade for justice will never be forgotten.